I bet you didn't think we'd be talking about Andy Warhol. Unless you don't know who Andy Warhol is, in which case such a question would have never occurred to you. Anyway, Andy Warhol, famous artist in the 1950s and especially the 1960s, who was on sort of the cutting edge of an artistic movement known as pop art that really reached its height in the 1960s, and he's the most famous representation of it. And here are a couple of his most famous paintings. Essentially, what pop art did was it took the focus away from traditional artistic subjects that were kind of elitist and looked at objects from popular culture and treated them as though they were elitist cultural objects. Now, was that elevating those pop culture objects into a higher status? Was that making an ironic statement about commercialism and therefore not actually being complimentary of the popular culture objects? Was it any one of a number of other things? Well, I mean, the answer, this is art, so it's in the eye of the beholder. Although a lot of people did interpret, well, a lot of people were confused. Like a lot of more traditional people who were used to more traditional artwork would look at a painting of a can of Campbell's soup and wonder why. What is the point? Other people might find some kind of existential meaning in that. Others, like I said, might view it as a statement about the sort of latent dangers and banality of capitalism and a consumerist culture. So the fact that this type of art is looking at things that are considered low culture, whether it be Hollywood movies or cans of soup or comic books and superheroes. This is Roy Lichtenstein, who's probably the most famous person after Andy Warhol in this movement. And he did a series of paintings in the 1960s that he painted in the style of comic books. In fact, this is looking at his painting from a distance. As you get up close, you'll see that it's individual little dots, just like the old time comic books were. So he's using those individual dots. This one is called Drowning Girl. It's his most famous painting, probably worth millions and millions of dollars. And he was a successful artist, so he made a pretty good living from these paintings. Now you can tell this is clearly done in a comic book style. In reality, it was essentially lifted right out of a comic book, as were all of his other paintings. And it wasn't even an old comic book. It was one from, this is from September 1962. The painting was unveiled in 1963, so it was practically new, right? A lot of the artists like Tony Abruzzo, who did this splash page in a romance story in DC's Secret Hearts, and Dick Giordano, whose work wound up in Lichtenstein's paintings, were not real happy about this. They felt like they had been plagiarized, and they felt like this guy was essentially making fun of them, and in so doing, making millions and millions of dollars, and they were not coming anywhere close to making millions and millions. They were lucky if they were making thousands of dollars. Anyway, this sort of thing caught on pretty quickly, and it kind of was a part of the appeal of the Batman TV show in 1966. There was a very cartoony opening to the show, and there was just some heavy irony. Like I said when I first mentioned it, it was very tongue-in-cheek. intentionally overdone, intentionally overacted and over dramatized, really making fun of the genre. And now it all depends on how you look at it. It could have been in a fun way that someone who appreciated the medium of comic books could play along with, or someone could be, insulted by it, that they were being played down to. Now, I will note that cartoon opening, the animated opening of the show, and even the live action, as they're having fights, these sound effects would pop up. The sound effects that were viewed as being the stereotypical sound effects from comic books, right? This had a big impact. It had a big impact, and you can tell because to this day, more than 50 years later, when there are newspaper articles or major journal or magazine articles about graphic art, they're likely to have in the title, to begin with, zap, pow, bam, people are reading comic books. And that harkens back to the fact that this, the TV show was, like I said, it was like in line with those pop art sensibilities, that it's cool to laugh at this low culture, which again, I emphasize, it's in the eye of the beholder. There are different shades of meaning, but if you're in the comic book business, or if you are an aficionado of comic books and you're still seeing this, it's very condescending, and that's where it started. Now, that's not to say that the comic book companies themselves didn't take advantage of this, with varying degrees of success. Well, there was a success in the comic book industry for DC when this TV show was so popular, because the sales of Batman went through the roof. And then when the show quickly faded from popularity, those sales went way down. But in 1966, when Batman was coming on and was at its height, Irwin Donnenfeld, remember him? The son of Harry Donnenfeld, the guy who had become a junior partner upon his graduation from college, and who by the 1960s was essentially the vice president of the company, in charge of marketing, essentially. He decided to cash in on the pop art thing, and here was his idea: go-go checks. Now, the pop art movement was closely aligned with the mod movement, as in modern. The styles and the music of 1966-67, especially as was coming out of London more than any place else. And a big part of that was go-go dancers. And the very term go-go was associated with hipness. There was a very famous music venue in Los Angeles called the Whiskey A Go-Go, where the Doors, among others, would play. So let's cash in on the fact that the kids like the go-go stuff. What does that even mean? It doesn't matter. These guys are like, the youngest ones are in their 50s. And they're going to try to figure out how to market to teenagers. So let's have a checkerboard, right? So the idea was, and let's take a look at one of the comics, that when they were doing this, they would have this checkerboard thing across the top, a strip across the top of all DC comics. Donnenfeld's idea was, well, call them go-go checks, just because whatever that means, the kids like it. And the checkerboard appearance was, when you're looking at the comics on those spinner racks, you're thumbing through them and you're only seeing the tops of them. This was so that the DC books would pop out, right? They would jump to the attention of the customer. Now, Carmine Infantino, who wound up taking over the editorial duties at DC shortly after this, said this is the stupidest thing he'd ever heard of, because essentially what it did was, there was no improvement on the content. The content of the DC Comics wasn't that great. That's why Marvel was doing so much better, because DC stories were not sophisticated at all. They were still at a much younger age level for the readers they were gearing toward. So essentially, putting these checkerboards on there told customers which books not to even bother looking at. This was used for over a year, and then it kind of faded away. Now, it seems kind of silly, but a much more direct effort to cash in on the pop art craze had actually come from Marvel. Kind of a similar thing the year before, 1965, when the identification of the company on the comics in the upper left-hand corner went from being Marvel Comics Group to Marvel Pop Art Productions. Right? It says pop art. People are going to buy it because they like that stuff. Except people don't care, because how is this even relevant? So this was only on the books for 5 months, from August to December of 1965. Anyway, the go-go checks just didn't work out. Nonetheless, the powers that be at DC Comics were more determined than ever to figure out how to be hip, because Marvel was catching up. They were still a distant number 2, but they were now number 2, right? And the reason for that was that the Marvel characters and the Marvel books were extremely popular with teenagers and college students who thought that Spider-Man and the Hulk were, groovy, man. And thought the same thing of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who were a couple of older guys, right? Stan Lee was, by this point, in his late 40s. Jack Kirby was in his 50s. The people who were working at DC were, well, most of them were a little bit older than that, but not too much. So why can't they catch the vibe? Well, if Jack Kirby can be hip, why can't his former partner, Joe Simon, who was brought on board to try to reach the young generation? Now, he had been editing Sick, the humor magazine, and continued to do so at the same time, and some other stuff that we'll talk about. But here he comes to try to figure it out. Now, in addition to the Joe Simon stuff, just the DC artists and writers in general were trying to zoom in for that younger audience. And for example, they had Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen get caught up with some long-haired hippie freaks who were protesting Superman, calling him a no-good heel. We hate Superman. And of course, one guy has to have the obligatory sign, "We hate money." That looter. This is hindsight, right? Hindsight is 2020, but I probably could have told them this at the time. If you want to appeal to college students, don't try to do it with stories that talk about how stupid and terrible college students are. Anyway, they brought Joe Simon on, and he helmed a new DC title called Brother Power, the Geek, which was about a store mannequin that is found by a bunch of hippies, and there's a lightning accident or something, and then he gets brought to life. He did that in late 68. Then he gave it another try in the early 70s with a title called Prez, about the first teenage president. It did a little better than Brother Power the Geek. And that's only because Brother Power the Geek only lasted 2 issues. In large part because, again, this was a big misfire on the part of DC. You've got Joe Simon, who's around 60 years old at this time, writing dialogue about the real life scene, man, of the dangers in hippie land. Joe Simon didn't like hippies. Most of these 60-year-old men that were making these books didn't like hippies, and they're trying to sell books to hippies who they don't understand and have probably never talked to. So Brother Power is unintentionally hilarious because it's this 60-year-old guy, Joe Simon, trying to look at things through the point of view of hippies. And they've got this horrible song they're singing. And then even Brother Power gets tired of the hippies. He's like, they're just too lazy. He's got to make something out of his life, even though he's a mannequin. I wonder why that didn't work. Well, let's move on now from DC's attempts to be hip, which we will be coming back to. And let's take a look at what's going on at the other companies here in the Silver Age. We haven't looked at them much. Now, we did briefly mention Dell. Dell Western had broken up in the early 60s and been divided into now it's Dell and it's Gold Key. And Dell had been the top-selling company in the 50s, but now they're broken in 2 pieces, and each of those pieces have just gradually slid way down the charts. Then you've got, the other various companies that make comics based on cartoon characters or comic strips, and they're still doing okay, but they're not doing nearly as well as they used to. The big thing now, just like in the early 1940s, the big thing had become superheroes. So DC had theirs, Marvel had theirs. Everyone else tried to get in on the act, including Charlton. We looked at this picture a little bit earlier when we were talking about, well, it might have been a spoiler there. We were talking about companies that weren't doing well enough to have cartoons and toys and so forth. Charlton, when they tried to bring back a line of superheroes for the first time since World War II, they brought Joe Simon on board for a while and brought back some of the old 1940s heroes like the Blue Beetle, and they made some new ones. Judo Master, who you would think would be an Asian guy, but he wasn't. Captain Atom by Steve Ditko. These heroes just kind of limped along until Charlton finally, Charlton kept going, but they sold. They sold their superhero characters to DC. Archie Comics, formerly MLJ back in the 40s, introduces a new line of superheroes under an imprint, the Mighty Comics Group, featuring the Mighty Crusaders, which, like Charlton, was a mix of their Golden Age characters and some new ones. So from the Golden Age, they had the Shield, right, who was once upon a time the star of Pep Comics, and they've got the Comet, who was killed off back in the 40s, and they've got new characters like the Fly by Simon and Kirby, and also Fly Girl, which is not the same kind of Fly Girl that was on In Living Color decades later. Well, they didn't last. They didn't catch on. Thunder Agents were from Tower Comics, which was done by Wally Wood. So Wally Wood and the Wood Studio provided stories and art for this line, including Thunder, but also one of the more interesting characters, the blue guy back there, is called No Man. These also didn't do so well, but I know that they're fondly remembered by many. Harvey Comics, the ones who did Sad Sack and Casper the Friendly Ghost and Richie Rich, they decided that they needed to have some superheroes. So 1966-67, that's when all these, by the way, were coming out with their superhero lines to try to cash in on the sudden popularity of superheroes. They brought Joe Simon, so he's doing this. This is right before he went over to DC to do Brother Power and the Geek. Somehow they managed to get a hold of the rights to use the Spirit, and other than that, it was some characters from the Golden Age that Simon and Kirby had created, which Simon still held the rights to, like Fightin' American, and newer characters that Simon created, like Spy Man, and the resurrection of a 1950s war comic from Harvey called, and you gotta love this, Dynamite Joe, the Blast Crazy Marine. These lasted about 2 or 3 issues each. I don't want to say they were bad, but DC didn't even buy them. However, it's all relative. It's all relative. By far the weirdest, craziest, and worst thing, in my opinion, to come out of all this in late 1966, early 67 was from Dell, who were trying to get in on the superhero thing. Dracula, Frankenstein, and Werewolf. Now, under the Comics Code Authority, no one was allowed to write stories about Dracula, Frankenstein, or Werewolf, or not about vampires, ghouls, or werewolves. But they're not vampires, ghouls, and werewolves. They're superheroes who happen to have monster names. These each lasted a grand total of 3 issues. So, I guess the point to take from this is that DC kicked off the Silver Age and kicked off the return of superheroes. Marvel kicked it up a notch and became incredibly popular to the point that they were coming around the track with the potential maybe to catch up with DC in success and popularity. There's one thing that was holding Marvel down, though, and that was the fact that they could only put out 8 magazines a month because of their deal with DC, who distributed their comics. Remember, Martin Goodman had gotten himself in that mess back in 1957, 58, and no one would take him on, and so he was at the mercy of DC, and they kind of choked Atlas Comics down to just 8 titles, which, well, 8 books a month. They had 16 titles, and they would take turns, bi-monthly. So now they're having all this success, but they cannot expand on it. Well, 1967, 67, Martin Goodman goes to Irwin Donnenfeld at DC with a request to renegotiate their bargain, which their contract was still good through 1969. So they got a couple of years to go on the contract, but Goodman wants to strike while the iron is hot with this popularity of his characters. So he requests the permission to expand to 12 titles from 8. Well, back in the 50s, DC didn't want Atlas to do well. They really don't want them to do well now that they're called Marvel and are potentially going to cut into their profits. Except Goodman pointed out, with all this increased interest, with the TV shows, with the toy licenses and all of this, both our companies are going to be ripe for sale, and we could all make a fortune. Let's make a little more and expand the familiarity with all our brands, and we will all prosper. So he was given permission to expand to 12 titles in 1968. So here's what had happened. Some of their titles had been shared by two popular characters. So like, for example, Tales to Astonish, instead of one 16-page story, each comic had two 8-page stories. One with the Hulk, one with the Submariner. Tales of Suspense, same thing. One story with Iron Man, who had debuted in Tales of Suspense, and one with Captain America. So, and then there were others. So it was decided that for each of these, they were going to let one character keep that book and the other character get a brand new book and start off with a number 1 issue. So there'd been some precedent for this at Marvel a couple of years before this, 1966. Journey into Mystery, where Thor had debuted with, I think he debuted, in issue 87? Around issue 123 or so. They just changed the title of the book from Journey into Mystery to Thor, but kept the same numbers, kept the same numbering. So that's what they did here. Tales to Astonish, the April issue, number 101, featured the Incredible Hulk and the Submariner, but the May issue, issue number 102, wasn't called Tales to Astonish. It was called The Incredible Hulk, and marketed on the front cover as a big premiere issue. And Prince Namor the Submariner gets his own book, starting at number 1. Same thing with Tales of Suspense, issue 99 in April. With issue 100, it becomes Captain America, big premiere issue. Whereas Iron Man gets his own book starting at number 1. Now, I didn't know this stuff when I was a kid in the 70s, and I was trying to do the math. How could there have been 300 issues of Thor and 180 issues of Iron Man when they had only been created a year or so apart? This is why. So those changes were made. Also, Strange Tales, which had featured Doctor Strange and Nick Fury. And by the way, these books that had two heroes sharing them, they tended to alternate and take turns on who got the cover. Okay, so Strange Tales, number 168, with issue 169, was now called Doctor Strange, Master of the Mystic Arts. Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., his own book with number 1. Captain Marvel had appeared in December of 1967. First appeared there in Marvel Superheroes, which previous to that had been a reprint book of Golden Age stories. In this one, it stays Marvel Superheroes, except it no longer stars Captain Marvel. Now it's going to star a different hero each month. And they started with Spider-Man because he was so popular. But after that, it became a tryout book, right? Where kind of like DC's Showcase, where they would have a new character, put him in there and see if he's going to be popular or not, he or she. And just a few issues after this, they debuted a group called Guardians of the Galaxy in Marvel Superheroes in 1969. And Captain Marvel got his own book. So there you go. Expansion from 8 titles to 12 titles. May 1968. Well, all that talk about selling things off, well, it's going to come to fruition.